In the 1970s, I watched a television show that featured the theme song, "The most important person in the whole wide world is you, and you hardly even know you." And it got me to thinking about this nugget, because the Privileged User Agreement is a document that you can have your administrators read carefully and sign. And think about it, oftentimes in the network, the most important people are the administrators, and they may not know themselves all that well. In other words, they may easily stumble into abusing those privileges that you're assigning them. Now, while the Privileged User Agreement or Access Agreement or whatever specific language that your attorney recommends that you use, while that document is critical, it does not have to be all that complex. Notice this sample one just consists of an introduction, definitions, terms and conditions, and then an area to sign. I might make a recommendation to you here that yours also include a section on recourse. So what happens when one of your administrators starts running into problems, conflicts? What would that look like, and what would they do? What procedures do you want them to follow? As far as the actual responsibilities, one of the things that you may want to consider incorporating would be your policy regarding least privilege. You could even spell out for the user the accounts that you are creating for them, recap the privilege levels that those accounts contain, and then emphasize that they're always to use the account with the least privilege in order to do their responsibilities. I want you to also keep in mind that this Privileged User Agreement does start to really integrate with the onboarding and offboarding process when it comes to these administrators. So I'll create a nugget for you on onboarding and offboarding, but just keep that in mind that these privileged users are going to have a slightly different offboarding, especially process that may be incorporated. One of the things we want to guard against is a situation like I recall reading about a couple of years ago, where there was a IT administrator in a big government organization here in the United States. And sure enough, they created a logic bomb, specifically a time bomb, so that after they were let go, about 60 days later, there was chaos in the network. Specifically, there was the sharing of personal information and credentials for coworkers that went on. And that probably could have been caught with a careful offboarding process involving that administrator, which would have included a careful audit of what that administrator had been up to, especially when it was clear that the administrator was going to be let go. So while I find that many enterprises do a really good job when it comes to policy documents, like a written security policy these days, because there's been so much made of that, I do find that a lot of enterprises do not think about a privileged user agreement. They're like, yeah, we have IT admins. Everybody knows that. The IT admins know what they're supposed to do. They're not going to abuse their privileges, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is an often overlooked policy document, and that's a real shame because, as we've discussed, it's not something that should consume a lot of your administrative resources to create. You don't even need to be in the field of information technology to know that password attacks, trying to get somebody's password, is forefront on the minds of computer criminals. As a result, you should have a password policy in writing for your organization, and this policy should accompany education to your end users on proper password procedures. Now, what most would think of when it comes to the password policy is, okay, what are going to be the requirements when it comes to setting a password in the organization? And most immediately begin thinking of things like, we're going to force the users into maybe at least 9 characters long for the password. We're going to make them use some numbers in the password, some special symbols in the password. You get the idea. But really, what's in popular fashion these days is to use what's called a passphrase. And that might be what we require our users to do in the password policy. Passphrases are great because they're really strong and they can be easy to remember. So maybe I make mine one that rhymes, like Ansible hyphen parable hyphen doable. It's amazing how strong that's going to end up and how relatively easy it is for me to remember that. Ansible hyphen parable hyphen doable. And of course, I could always add like pound sign and then 121 to the end or something to make it even stronger. So a lot of password policies that you see these days are going to focus on this passphrase type of approach. I switched pens to this one I'm using right now, and I kind of like it. Anyways, now what else might be in the password policy document, and what else would we seek to educate our users about in this area? Well, we're going to teach them that whenever they are legitimately providing their password, they want to make awfully sure that no one is observing that behavior. You could have the strongest password in the world, but if someone is literally watching you input it, that's going to be a problem. And I think it is critical that we educate them that we or anyone in the IT arena is never going to ask them for their password. We also have to teach them about phishing scams and spear phishing and all those types of attacks that are going to be going after their password. So we need to educate them on that. And we also need to educate them on when they install some piece of software, it could easily contain additional malware. And one of those pieces of software might even be a keylogger where their password's being entered and those keystrokes are being sent to a computer criminal. So there is a lot to have in the password policy, potentially a lot to educate our users about beyond just the rules that they are going to use to build good, strong passwords in the organization. Onboarding and offboarding refers to the careful procedures that you're going to follow when you hire someone new in your organization. And if that person is leaving, voluntarily or otherwise, offboarding refers to the cleanup, if you will, of the resources that that individual is going to possess. And also the procedural aspects of them leaving the organization. So what documents might they need to sign and things of that nature. These are very important processes, the onboarding and the offboarding process, when it comes to things like your network security. Let's just think of some examples of onboarding procedures and resources that we might need to walk through. So we hire a new employee, we must generate their unique ID number, we must generate and do their username and password. And when it comes to the password, we must make sure we're adhering to the password policy of the organization. We probably have to print them an ID card and code that correctly. We have to set up their email, set up their workstation, set up their mobile device, give them the appropriate training on all of these mechanisms, as well as other procedures and policies in the organization. We must make sure they understand the human resource software, things like requesting time off and inputting their tax exemptions and all that great stuff. And think about the offboarding. We need to properly accommodate the return of all of these resources and the cleanup of these resources. And then we may have to be performing audits on what that individual had access to, how we're going to hand that off. So this can be a very, very involved process. And also notice that it will evolve over time. Things in your organization are eventually going to change. New software and new processes will be implemented, and you have to accommodate that. Now, the great news is for you as a network administrator, there are mechanisms and best practices that you can take advantage of to ease the burden of your onboarding and offboarding tasks. to demonstrate this, let's take a look at Microsoft's Active Directory. This is a hands-on lab, by the way, so you have a link in your desktop software if you'd like to follow along with me. Notice I'm going to drop in the password and log in as our domain administrator. And what I'm going to do is go to the Active Directory Users and Computers console, because that's where we would be onboarding and offboarding from a directory service standpoint. So I choose the Server Manager icon down here on the taskbar. And once the Server Manager launches, I'm going to go to the Tools menu and I'm going to select the Active Directory Users and Computers tool. Now, it is very simple to create a new Active Directory user account within the directory service, but that would get pretty cumbersome if we didn't follow some type of best practice. And the best practice here is to use a template for the creation of your new onboarding user accounts. So what you can do is in our users container, we can right click and we can say that we want to create a new user account. And when it comes time to name that user account, we can do an underscore so that it's always going to be at the top of the list on a name sort. And I could say like power underscore user underscore template. I'll then copy this and I will paste it in for the user login name, which isn't really relevant because we're never going to log in as this template account. And notice that here we say the user's not going to be changing the password at next login. In fact, the user cannot change the password. And this is what's really going to make it a template. It's going to be disabled. So we are not logging in ever as this account. We choose next, and we finish the creation of this template. Now we can go in to the properties of this user account and further customize things. So everything that our power users are going to have capabilities for, resources, particular network connections. I mean, we're going to go in and we're going to configure all of the commonalities regarding this template that we would want the users to have that we create from this template. We then simply right-click the template when we hire someone, choose copy, and then we fill it in with the appropriate details for that user that we've actually hired. Now, what about offboarding? Well, if we're offboarding, what we might want to do is, let's say test J user is leaving the organization, we can right-click, go to the properties of that account, and on the account tab, notice we can go in and we can disable the account. So we can say account is disabled. That will give us time to create perhaps a new account for the new hire that's going to assume those responsibilities. And then we might even assign this same account, modifying some properties, to that new hire. There will be policies and procedures that you put in place that must be followed here, but my point was to show you just how easy something like Active Directory services from Microsoft would make it for you to onboard and offboard following the appropriate procedure. An important area of policy and procedures centers around licensing restrictions and requirements. Think about it. You, as the administrator of the network, you are going to be implementing systems, both hardware and software, and you need to make sure that you are following the license requirements. And then when you start having your end users use this stuff, you need to make sure you educate them as to what exactly they're licensed to do with the hardware and the software. So we're following careful requirements and procedures, and then we need to ensure that our end users are doing the same. And complying with licensing restrictions and procedures can be tricky because this often involves reading the information that we are so accustomed to skipping. Fortunately, companies are doing a better job of giving us frequently asked questions documents about licensing agreements. Here is TechSmith with the Camtasia product as an example, and this is what we do at CBT Nuggets. We do volume licensing with Camtasia, and notice they'll step through and say, look, you're licensed per user, and what does per user exactly mean? Well, in this case, it means that each user can install one copy of the software product on up to 2 computers for their sole use, provided only one computer is in use at a given time, and this would include home, work, laptop, and desktop systems. So we often have the initial licensing agreement, but thankfully we have supplemental materials that surround it so that we can make sure we're in compliance. Now, the most common question I get from learners in this area is involving like public cloud. So how would licensing work in that environment? And the answer is, like so many things in life, it depends. Here we are at Amazon Web Services as an example, and if I go into the virtual machines area called EC2, and let's say I want to spin up a new virtual machine in my public cloud, notice there is this initial list of Amazon machine images, and this would include something like Microsoft Windows Server 2016 base, and notice that this is free tier eligible. So what's happening is when I spin this up, and if I'm a new Amazon Web Service user under the free tier, there is no cost for me for the software or the hardware. It's pretty amazing. So clearly, Amazon Web Services is paying Microsoft for me spinning this up, and they're paying for the licensing. Outside of the free tier, things might change with that, but I can tell you for this image, you would not be paying for the software, you'd be paying just for the hardware. Amazon will continue, in the case of this image, to pay for the licensing of the software for you. But things can definitely change. For instance, if I go into the Amazon Web Service Marketplace, and maybe I want to spin up this cool Barracuda Next Gen Firewall F-Series image, notice that they're going to tell me, okay, look, if you spin it up on an M4 extra large instance inside of Amazon, that means we're going to have lots of memory, lots of CPU. What we're going to be paying is $1.88 per hour of usage. 20 cents of that is the EC2 hardware resources, and $1.68 per hour, the bulk of the expense, is for the licensing of the software from Barracuda. So inside of a public cloud, there will be a breakdown like this for you, typically, on costs associated with the hardware and, most importantly for our discussion, the licensing of the software. Organizations these days tend to be more global than ever. Even a little mom and pop shop might find themselves exporting things all over the world. When we start moving goods and services and even data across the United States boundaries, and I'll use the United States in this example because that's where I'm located, when we start exporting things outside of the United States, we have to make sure that we are complying with the international export controls set up by the government of the United States. Fortunately, there are great resources that you can access for free online that are going to help you comply with the various export controls that you might be subject to. Notice there will be special areas that will literally train you on appropriate compliance. This is super important because while there is a list that I would love to get myself on, that would be the best sellers list on Amazon.com, there is one list I definitely don't want to end up on. Here we can see the individuals and companies that are not permitted to export stuff out of the United States because they failed to meet the compliance requirements and violated the law. And think about it, this is another area where the public cloud gets really interesting, because if you're engaged in something like Amazon Web Services, you have the ability at your fingertips to start creating resources all over the globe. Now, Amazon handles this by literally not making some resources available to you in certain areas. So making sure you're in compliance with laws there. And they also provide you tools like the service catalog where you can create and manage portfolios of your various products and services, and then you can easily manage user access around the globe to those services and resources to try and ensure that you are staying in compliance with the appropriate laws of your home country. Now, you should note that this is definitely an area where you may want to engage in the acquisition of professional legal advice and consultation. In fact, this is an area where many organizations end up building an internal legal department. They realize, my goodness, we could really use lawyers on staff that could help us with licensing restrictions, contract negotiations, and of course, international export concerns. Well, hello there, Anthony Sequeira, and congratulations on you being hired as the IT manager here at abccompany.com. Just wanted to let you know that the snack machine is located over there in the corner. There's all the carbonated beverages you can drink available there at the soda fountain. And, oh yeah, one more thing. Any of our data gets lost, you're fired. Now, while my dramatization might be exaggerated a bit, it is worth pointing out that if you're in an organization that has a lot of sensitive data, it can feel like your full-time job is making sure stuff doesn't get lost. That's why a great, well-thought-through data loss prevention strategy and policy is going to be critical in a lot of organizations today. Now, first of all, from a scope perspective, realize that most data loss prevention strategies are going to identify the network and the surrounding components into three groupings. There's client, network, and storage. Client refers to data that is in use. Network refers to data that is in transit. And storage refers to data that is at rest. So we want to think in terms of those three areas if it is a comprehensive data loss prevention strategy that we have been tasked with. Some tips for you in this area of DLP. Certainly investigate your organization and see what kind of risk versus reward studies have been done. So you want to make sure that you understand what assets are at risk and what assets are extremely sensitive. You're not going to be investing typically in the same DLP measures across all of your resources in an organization. Some are public resources and they're going to require very little security, while there can be tremendous risks with highly sensitive information, and you're clearly going to be spending more resources in the data loss prevention area on those key resources. Keep in mind that when you are developing this data loss prevention policy, you're probably going to invite many different players to the table. This could involve managers from different departments and even more frontline employees to get their input on what needs to be done to keep things secure. You probably are going to want to implement your data loss prevention in stages or phases, and you would be thinking in terms of data at rest, data in motion, data in operation with a client as you are implementing those phases. One thing that we need to do, this is another one of those areas of IT where it's a balancing act. We want to try and minimize as many of the negatives to our operations as possible. So, just think in terms of maintenance windows and things of that nature for your security enhancements, because it's not like you can just say to the organization, all right, look, we're going to shut everything down for a few weeks while we figure out how to secure it. So you'll want to minimize the negative disruptions to the operation of your company as much as possible. And then I'm sure you've already been thinking about this. In order for data loss prevention strategies to be effective, they must be consistently and carefully monitored. And then you need to take all that data and you need to review just how effective they are. Are you getting the level of security that you want and need? And are you spending the appropriate amount of cold, hard cash in this endeavor? One of the things that technology has done is it's enabled us to take our workforce and spread them out all over the place. More people than ever are working while on the road. More people than ever are working from home on some days, or in my case, all of the time. So remote access becomes increasingly important in organizations today. And this can be a big area of challenge and opportunity for us as IT administrators, because think about it, right off the bat, we are connecting to some other remote network, and we might not have the level of control over the security mechanisms that are in use in that remote network. And that's why building a strong remote access policy and set of procedures can be so important. It might incorporate the remote network that we are connecting to. If it's some partner that we're working with, so we really don't have control over that network, we might put in place in the policy certain conditions that absolutely have to exist in order for us to make that communication. For example, perhaps there is some level of authentication that must be done, obviously levels of encryption that must be taken place, and integrity checks to ensure that we're as safe as possible when communicating with that remote site. And keep in mind that we have the transit path to worry about too. So there could be procedures and policies in place, for example, when we're accessing public cloud, where we must do this over a VPN connection, and maybe the VPN connection we mandate must be IPsec technology of a certain strength. So you can see where we're going here with the remote access policy. One of the things that you would want it to include would be a clear-cut scope definition. So does this remote access policy cover remote office branch offices, home offices? Does it cover connections to the private cloud, to the public cloud? And then the bulk of our remote access policy is going to be the gory details. And I do want you to get very specific here. So the specific encryption standards that must be used, the specific authentication protocols and techniques that must be used should be all laid out. It's also a great idea, like so many other policy documents that we might create, to clearly delineate for your users what the consequences are if they should violate these policies. Remember, since we are communicating outside the bounds of like the headquarters office when we do remote access typically, there could be a real negative implication here if the policies aren't followed. And finally, the remote access policies by no means are going to exist in a vacuum. They are going to be heavily related to other security policies and maybe bring your own device policies and procedures of that nature. So keep that in mind. You'll probably want to reference those related policies in your remote access policy. The self-help guru Tony Robbins often says that what he likes to do when considering some action that he's about to take is he likes to focus on the absolute worst possible result of that action. And then, of course, inevitably, whatever does maybe go wrong with what he's going to do, it's never quite as bad as what he prepared for. And that's kind of the theme when we are designing our incident response policy. We want to step through and we want to outline exactly how we would react if the absolute worst happened inside of our network. And we can think of so many things, can't we, as we design the different policies, like a password policy. We can think about how people would try and circumvent a really good password policy, either maliciously or accidentally. We can think of our bring your own device policy and all the problems that could result there. So let's step through the phases that would be typical in a real healthy incident response policy. Houston, we may have a problem. What does the Command Center Houston start doing? Well, they immediately start preparing for whatever incident might be happening with this starship. So the preparation phase is really what most incident response policies are going to have as their first phase. So this is identifying, okay, do we really have an incident? And if so, how are we going to very quickly start going through the rest of the phases of our policy? And notice the next phase makes sense. It's the identification phase. What precisely is the incident that we are having? Is it a security breach? Is it a failure in the network of some device? Maybe it was the time for that device to fail. We had reached the mean time between failures, and it was that device's time. So the prepare and identification phases are critical. If we are dealing with some type of a security breach, oftentimes we then need to move into a phase of containment. Here we have two main goals. We're trying to protect things and keep critical computing resources from being harmed, and we're also trying to figure out just how bad is the infected system. Can we save the kind of ground zero point of the infection in the network, or do we have to start ripping that device and other devices around it offline? We then would have an eradicate phase. And remember, this does not restrict itself to like some kind of virus as it might sound. Here we're talking about removing the problem from the network, whatever problem that might be, and eliminating that issue entirely. And then we move into a phase really designed to restore everything back to the service level agreement that we desire. So we call this phase the recovery phase. And clearly there's going to be a lot of monitoring that go on here so that we can make sure we've got things back to just the way we need them. Like so many of our policies, we will be doing a careful review. And notice this review process is always kicked off by the moving through these phases of our incident response policy. So this one kind of has a built-in review mechanism. We would want to be reviewing how things went and how effective we were and how much money it cost us and time it cost us. And of course, we all know that time is money. So there's going to be a consistent review, hopefully, with our incident response policy if we're doing it right. As I discuss the various best practices and policies that you can design today into your IT infrastructure, I can't help but thinking about the past, specifically how much has changed. When I began in this industry, it was I almost said 64, but no, it was 1994 when I really got started in the IT industry, and I was with IBM in Tampa, Florida in the support department, and all we had to worry about was IBM employees. The internal employees were who we supported. All we really had to worry about was them bringing their own software to the party. I remember troubleshooting one laptop and discovering that the young lady that worked for IBM had loaded some applications that were included on her Rolling Stones Greatest Hits CD, and that had fouled up her IBM ThinkPad. These days, your list of concerns could be a lot longer with the bring your own device paradigm that is common in networks today. So you will want to make sure that there is a clear-cut bring your own device strategy and written policy that your employees are going to be reading carefully and signing off on. And as you might guess, it really all begins with what devices are permitted to begin with. Is an employee allowed to bring in their own phone and connect it perhaps to the corporate network? Are they allowed to bring in their own tablet? The devices that are permitted are then going to need to adhere to a security policy that you outline, and also keep in mind you need to inform them of the support policy. Maybe we have an application that we encourage they install on their own device, and we may need to explicitly make it clear to them that we support the application, not the device itself. So when they drop their iPad and crack that screen, they are not to come to our internal support department for help with that situation. We also want to make it clear who owns what, who exactly owns what components, what applications that have to do with these devices, and you're probably going to want to explicitly permit certain applications. there is excellent software around the area of bring your own device. And one of the things these software packages can do is they can restrict the permitted applications and even permitted internal functions of those devices. One package that I actually had the privilege of providing training on here at CBT Nuggets inside my Windows 10 courses is Microsoft's Intune, a really impressive web-based software application that you can deploy out to your users' devices and have really great control of those devices. And you may choose to do this, of course, when they are in your corporate environment. So when they connect to the corporate network, the policies that you have start taking effect. I couldn't believe the extent of what you can do to a device, a mobile device that is inside the corporate confines. And Intune even supports non-mobile device control as well. So you could use this product to control their Windows desktops as well. But it was pretty amazing. I mean, I didn't know you could do things with packages like this, like take away the camera. That's right. Completely have the camera functionality be wiped from the device dynamically when they enter a certain area. And quick funny story, I used my own phone for a demonstration of taking away the camera and then forgot to put it back and was at a birthday party and had no camera on my phone. A bit of an embarrassing moment, but the great news is thanks to Intune policies, I was able to easily put my camera back as the administrator of the Intune service. Now, we know that many of these policies are going to closely relate to other policies that we've designed for our IT infrastructure, and the bring your own device policy is no exception. Notice that it is most likely going to integrate very closely with the acceptable use policy as well as the offboarding policy. There's probably going to be specific procedures that you want to do when someone is leaving the organization. It is conceivable that you could have an employee inside of your network doing things that are not acceptable to you and your company. We do have to kind of cut that employee a break if they literally didn't know it wasn't allowed. Think about an employee that's using their PC that you set them up with to do things like mine bitcoins. They could pretty easily turn to you and say, well, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that. And I certainly hate to get all negative here, but what if they were doing something that was completely illegal and they didn't realize it? And then you have problems when it comes to the law coming after your organization. So we can avoid these sticky situations by creating an acceptable use policy and making sure that our employees read and sign, most importantly, sign this AUP. A typical acceptable use policy would have sections like I've listed here. There would be an overview explaining, maybe even reminding them of the mission of your organization, but certainly this acceptable use policy overview would contain why the acceptable use policy exists to begin with. Then we might give the specific purpose of the AUP. What is it designed to protect the employee and the organization from? And then we would want to do scope. Does this include things like the hardware we've given them, the software we've given them, the mobile device we've given them? You get the idea. So the scope will clearly be defined here. And then the meat of any AUP is going to be the policies itself. And notice that these will probably be broken down into these categories that we outlined in the scope. So you could have a section on the hardware you've given them and its acceptable use, the software you've given them and the acceptable use of that software. It's pretty important to have a compliance section that's going to outline for them exactly what they can expect if they violate the acceptable use policy, and then it's a great idea to link to related documents. For example, one of the things we might link to is the password policy document that outlines how they're going to be required to set password protection. Notice this is very similar to the acceptable use document, so we would want to link to these related documents for the benefit of our employees. And then it might be a good idea to wrap up this document with the definition of key terms, especially some of the more technical terms that the end user might not fully understand. One of those might be something like public cloud. You and I know exactly what public cloud is, but that might be a little fuzzy for one of our end users. If you've taken an IT certification exam recently, you probably signed an NDA. It was that long page you probably didn't read right before the exam started, and then you chose the yes, you accept option. And what you're saying there is that you won't disclose the actual test questions inside of that exam. In this, we're going to take a close look at an NDA and what it might contain as it would apply to your IT infrastructure. A non-disclosure agreement is between at least two parties, but notice there can be different types of these. At CBT Nuggets, I signed a unilateral non-disclosure agreement. That means CBT Nuggets, the company, has me sign this agreement, and this agreement says that CBT Nuggets is going to be sharing with me all kinds of secrets about how we make our nuggets and how we produce our nuggets and inventions that we're going to be creating along the way for our apps and our websites. And I won't disclose this proprietary secret information about the workings of our company with the public, for instance. By the way, this is always a tough one for me because I want to tell everyone about the cool stuff we're inventing. So it is a frequent thing that I do is going to our legal department or a marketing department head, for example, and saying, hey, can I share this via my blog site, for example, this cool thing we're about to do? And of course, the CBT Nuggets representative is always great about telling me either yes or no. Oftentimes what will happen is they'll say, yes, you can share it on such and such a date. So that's a unilateral non-disclosure agreement. CBT Nuggets, remember, is the one that is sharing the information with me. There may be a bilateral non-disclosure agreement that is used in your organization's IT infrastructure where the organization is sharing secrets with you and you are sharing secrets with the organization, and both parties agree that they won't disclose that. A multilateral type NDA is when we have three parties. So maybe it's three different companies and one of those companies is going to be sharing this information. And again, those additional companies that it shared the information with cannot share that info publicly. When you are tasked with designing or helping to design the non-disclosure agreement of your organization, I want to tell you, make sure you be as specific as possible. So if you are designing some new type of network infrastructure for the cloud, let's say, you're going to be talking about the specifics of what can and cannot be disclosed in the non-disclosure agreements. You don't want anything overly vague that would cause issues in a unilateral agreement, let's say with your employees, that would cause issues for them to not fully understand what they can share and what they can't share. Now, maybe you're like me and you're not in a networked environment where there's going to be a lot of safety procedures and policies that you need to follow. But at the very least, you want to be encouraging your employees to really pay attention to both the installation and the maintenance guides that accompany their network equipment. Like so many of us, we tend not to read the manual, especially when we're as smart with technology as we are. But there's going to be many, many procedures that you should follow inside of these guides to not only keep the equipment running smoothly for as long as possible, but also to make sure that there isn't injury caused by the device. There can be, with our larger network devices, specific instructions on how you should lift and maybe rack mount the equipment, and these should definitely be paid attention to. Your safety procedures and policies in your network might also include specific safety equipment that you want your employees to use, and give them guidelines about working with electricity, which inevitably they're going to be doing when they're working with the network equipment. There might be other specific risks that you want to think about when it comes to your network and and your networking equipment, be sure to list that in the safety procedures and policies for your users as well.
Thanks for watching our second and press the button below, like, subscribe, and bell icon.